I'd like to acknowledge on behalf of Aboriginal Housing Victoria that we're on the country of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay respects to them. I'd like to pay respects to their ancestors and their elders past and present. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal lands across Victoria that have never been ceded.
My name is Damien Bell. I'm a Gunditj Mara and I'm also a board member of Aboriginal Housing Victoria.
I'm Darren Smith. I'm the CEO of Aboriginal Housing Victoria. I'm a Palawa man. Been living in the lands here in Naarm for the last 30 odd years. We see this as a great opportunity to provide some input into the Yoorrook Commission's inquiry into land and justice in Victoria.
Probably the biggest question in the world. Yeah, the work that we do at Aboriginal Housing Victoria on behalf of the Victorian Aboriginal community is to make sure everyone's got a safe home, whether it's a house, a dwelling, people sleeping rough, making sure our houses are appropriate enough for our families, because our families are cultural families. You could need a big residence, a smaller residence as our community changes, the profile of our community changes. But to have that security of a home is something that was taken away from us way back when with the dispossession of our land. So that's why our community, particularly our elders and organisations like Aboriginal Housing Victoria and all the other AHHFs in the state that do community housing, on just caring for our community, we've all got that job to do to redress that dispossession and to build ourselves up to be culturally strong and to redress what was taken from us. And land injustice, we need to address that because it's a big part of it. We need this government in Victoria and the Commonwealth to really listen to us as Aboriginal people, to what we know is best for our own people.
One of the things I find a little bit challenging is the idea of homelessness in traditional communities. I don't think, mobs in Victoria really had a practical experience of homelessness until they were dispossessed from country. And I think home's the refuge. It's a place that you go so that you can recover, so that you can steel yourself, so that you can go out and make your way in the bigger world out there. So you can draw that straight line between, the Hinties arriving in Melbourne and their travels up to Portland and, the dispossession, the dislocation, the destruction of homes, Aboriginal people becoming fringe dwellers on the edge of towns. It kind of maps its way to the current experiences of homelessness that Aboriginal people have where, we're 10 times overrepresented in accessing homelessness services. And you kind of ask the question, why hasn't something been done about this? Why has it been allowed to continue for, 150, 200 years?
On Gunditj Mara country, our ancestors built stone villages. And when the invasion happened and we were taken off the land and concentrated onto Lake Condamation, those stone villages were deconstructed and built to build new European infrastructure to demarcate the land. That link of being dispossessed from our homes back then still exists today. In Victoria, we have the effect of the Native Title Act, we have the Traditional Owner Settlement Act in Victoria, and we have our Aboriginal Heritage Act. They're layers of legislation that lay across our land and attempt to separate our continuing connection to country. That's part of the struggle. That's what Aboriginal people, particularly traditional owners, are on the front line of doing. You would want those acts, because they're there more to benefit non-Aboriginal people, government, organisations, developers, local government. You would want to see more inclusion in those, the agreements that come out of those acts to benefit Aboriginal people and traditional owners, particularly with housing, because all those acts, they directly affect land. And the most important thing that we have our connection to is land, not only for culture, for our families, for our communities, it's for housing. We know there's a housing crisis. We've always been in a housing crisis for 250 years. So this housing crisis is, I suppose the magnitude is something new because it's affecting us even more as Aboriginal Victorians. We really need to look at those legislations and other legislations to free up land for our communities.
Native title and traditional owner settlement acts are limited because they don't necessarily provide freehold title back. They might provide land back, but it's not land that's going to be able to provide housing necessarily at the moment. So it's a gap. It's a gap. And if you think about what housing does in the modern world, housing is the primary vehicle for wealth creation for most of the people in society. And if you're not providing that to Aboriginal people, and if you're not providing the land back, and you're not providing the opportunities to participate in the economy, then Aboriginal people are not being restored to where they were prior to being dispossessed. While you can understand the contemporary housing experiences of Aboriginal people and the origin and dispossession, we do need solutions that are going to work for Aboriginal people, because we can't endure continuing homelessness at the level that it is at the moment. What we know is happening in the Aboriginal community at the moment is that we're 10 times overrepresented in accessing homelessness services. Has been increasing by about 8%, 10% a year. We've also seen Aboriginal people being housed in public housing at an increased rate of about 10% a year. And this has been going on because nobody's been working on the housing solutions for Aboriginal people. And what we need is a really strong safety net of homelessness services that support Aboriginal people and house them. And we also need the social housing supply to be there so that Aboriginal people can get a house quickly and be housed. Over the last couple of years, we've just seen things spiralling out of control. When we went and were consulting with the Aboriginal community and developing Manana Warnti and Mata Court, it was a really clear message coming from the community, and particularly from down your end of the state, around this idea of home ownership and the importance of home ownership and the importance of supporting young people so they can actually access home ownership. At the moment, we have a system that needs to be oriented differently for Aboriginal people so that we can achieve these longer term, really important fundamental goals for Aboriginal people.
With the work that our communities are doing through Aboriginal Housing Victoria and through our AHHFs across the state, we really need those additional support services to look after our people affected by domestic violence, those emergency situations. And we also need for people coming out of incarceration, and also all those bits of the correction services that keep our people away from their homes, or a place to call home. So to extend what we do, needs to address those issues as well and provide for those issues. When I was born, down near Lake Conda Mission, we were living just around the corner from the mission, but that was 1969. The houses, the commission houses, were already being built in Hayward. I've been told that when I was the baby out of our big family, we moved into town. We moved into next to Grandma, who was in there already, and that's how we transitioned from being out bush into town. And a lot of families did that from the Lake Conda Mission into Hayward, into Hamilton, into Portland. If we had our choice I believe, and listen to the stories of our elders and my older cousins and all that, we'd still be living out in the bush. You know, we'd have deadly houses, but we would still be out there. We would have land to do farming, to have that community, to look after ourselves, like we had at the mission. Even though we were concentrated on the mission was self-sufficient, but it was too successful. So we got shifted into town, into commission houses, to work for white fellas. So to have that opportunity to live where we want to live as Aboriginal people, as traditional owners, to continue our connection to country, that's important. And it's a principle that somehow needs to be addressed through this Yoorrook Commission inquiry. How it comes out the other end with recommendations, I'm not sure, but we do have a lot of capacity that's been built up through our through Aboriginal Housing Victoria, through our AHHFs, to work with that mainstream housing industry, whether it be social housing, whether it be with the developers that are there that are required to make sure social housing is part of their developments. They need a directive to say you need to work more with the Aboriginal community and their organisations to produce the outcomes that we need. You know, and again, we know we're part of a bigger picture of the housing crisis, but our crisis is our crisis. That's what we're responsible for, and we need to do that. And I suppose it's good to have that support and that partnership that we have with the industry and all its stakeholders. And it's important to call them stakeholders because as Aboriginal people, we're the rights holders. It's everyone else with their stakes in our country. We still need that relationship on their side of the story to be directed to do better. Because if they do better for social housing in general, that means we're going to do a lot better as Aboriginal housing in Victoria.
On this long journey towards restoration that Yoorrook's going to provide recommendations and the Assembly, the First Peoples Assembly is going to pick up and action. It's really important that we don't lose focus on building that safety net of effective homelessness services that house Aboriginal people and social housing for Aboriginal people, for the more vulnerable members of the community that need it. We can't take that full step to achievement of equity and home ownership rates that are going to be sustained and the creation of wealth without having that foundation in place. It's fundamentally important. At the moment, the Victorian government is investing in social housing through the big housing build. The Commonwealth government is going to be investing through the Housing Australia Future Fund. These are all opportunities that the Aboriginal community, through our Aboriginal community controlled organisations and traditional owner groups, need to be able to access those opportunities and to build more housing. But even with those and the investments that are on the table, the Aboriginal share is not going to be sufficient to actually provide the amount of social housing that we're going to need for Aboriginal people in Victoria. Population projections that we did when we were developing Manana, Warntia and Martac Court were predicting that the Aboriginal population in 20 years is going to double and the number of households is going to double. And what that means is that the number of Aboriginal families needing social housing is also going to double. And it was of the order of 5,000 additional social housing units for Aboriginal people with no plan to actually get there. Now, the steps that the Victorian government and the Commonwealth government are taking are a step in the right direction, but we need more. We actually need to ensure that we have the kind of investment. We're looking at an additional 300 houses a year for social housing for Aboriginal people, which over 5 years is an investment of $800 million. We're not there yet. We're not close.
There's a couple of ways to go forward. with the legislation that's there that recognises Indigenous rights, Aboriginal rights, like the Native Title Act, Traditional Owner Settlement Act, particularly those two, traditional owners have to be supported to have the return of land. Not just through Aboriginal title for national parks and all that, but the return of land that's sitting within towns, that's sitting within cities. There's a lot of unused public land, or what they call in public land, that can be returned to traditional owners. And traditional owner organisations, they have close working relationships with Aboriginal community controlled organisations. They're out in the community, whether it's rural, remote or urban. They can sit down and work out the best way for our community to address our housing crisis. The release of land for a new tenure for that land to be there for social housing. And say 20 years down the road, it might be available for those homes that are built on that land to be brought by the tenant. There's lots of programs like that around. We really need to ramp that up. We need to look at this over the next 50 years, because that's just a couple of generations. According to our community, with our demographics, we can do a lot over 50 years because we're always thinking in that length of time. We need to cover our short gaps at the moment, but still have that big long-term vision, because we need to look after the kids, the grandkids and beyond, as well as our elders, because our elders are the foundation of our culture and our connection.
And there's some simple things that government can do in order to provide that land for housing for Aboriginal communities. So, government does often have surplus land, which is what you're talking about. Well, they can set up some processes and some targets around that land about providing it back to Aboriginal communities, either through traditional owners or through Aboriginal community controlled organisations, but for the purpose of building more housing. And it applies, it's not just to state governments, it's also local governments as well. So local governments also have underutilised and surplus land, and they can do the same thing. So through their processes, they can set aside some of that. And it doesn't, we're not talking about 100%. We're talking about a small proportion of that land that's set aside to go to the Aboriginal community for housing. It's a fairly simple thing to do. The other thing that local councils can do, and the state government, where it controls the planning processes, is it can actually structure the way that it makes land available for developers, and through the developers' agreements, so that there is land that is set aside to be purchased by Aboriginal community controlled organisations and by traditional owner groups for the purpose of providing low cost and affordable housing, social housing, and even for low cost and affordable home ownership for Aboriginal people. Even if all councils and state government were applying a very small target, in aggregate, what it means is that there's an opportunity for Aboriginal organisations. They still have to have the capital to purchase the housing, but it provides that opportunity so that we can actually start to acquire the housing that the Aboriginal community needs.
We also have to recognise the work that our communities do with the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation and with Indigenous Business Australia, that offers that opportunity for Aboriginal people to own their own homes. So that's very important to acknowledge that. The inquiry talks about land injustice, and in that context it talks about country for us, which is land, which is waters, which is sky. Well, guess what? With these initiatives and these recommendations that we're making to address Aboriginal homelessness and making safe homes for us, with those recommendations, the sky isn't going to fall in. It's going to be better. The broader community is going to get some learnings from what we do as Aboriginal community, and it's always for the better. Just to thank our communities for all the struggle and the advocacy that's helped set up the Yoorrook Justice Commission to help us investigate our concerns about land injustice and how it's linked to us having safe homes for our communities to thrive, to prosper, and to be cultural and to continue our connection to country.
I would like to thank the Yoorrook Justice Commissioners for the time that they've given us, for the opportunity to speak to them, and we look forward to working with you further.